Good morning, everybody. Welcome to St. Louis County Library's virtual program, Sexual Morality in the People's Republic of Poland. I'm Melissa Bauer, Assistant Manager of Adult Services for St. Louis County Library. Before we get started, I wanted to bring to your attention a few functions of Zoom in case this is your first virtual program with us. First of all, this is a webinar, which means that we cannot see or hear you, but you should be able to see and hear us. We are live right now, and this program is being recorded, which will be available within a few days on the St. Louis County Library's YouTube page, which I will link to you in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. At this time, please go ahead and turn the volume up on your own personal device and choose the speaker view in the top right-hand corner of your screen. Also, be sure to fill out our virtual sign-in sheet at the end of the program, which I will also send to you via the chat box. For 2021, the library has partnered with a slew of local cultural institutions and local museums. In February, we have a variety of programs planned with the National Park Service, Opera Theater St. Louis, and the Missouri Historical Society. Be sure to check out www.slcl.org/events for the calendar of all of our upcoming programs. And remember, you do not have to have a library card or even live in St. Louis County to attend our virtual programs. So if you enjoyed today's program, please be sure to tell a friend or family member to meet you here next time. Now it is my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Jarek Czernicki. Jarek, I'm so sorry, I just butchered your name. Jarek Czernickiewicz and Michal Kwiecien with St. Louis Polonia, a nonprofit whose purpose is the promotion of knowledge about the 1,000-year-long history of Poland and its ethnic diversity, as well as appreciation of the Polish contribution into the world's culture. Jarek and Michał, thank you so much for being with us this morning, and I will let you take it away.
Thank you, Melissa. Let me share my screen first, and then we can get started. All right, can you see my screen? Please confirm.
Yes, we sure can.
Okay, so thank you very much. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Jarek Czernickiewicz. I'm the president of St. Louis Polonia. We are a Missouri non-profit association dedicated to promoting knowledge about Polish culture. We subscribe to a way of thinking about Poland that is multicultural, diverse, inclusive, and pan-European. Our goal is share our time and resources to create educational and cultural and charitable initiatives that inform and inspire. Our programs cover various Poland-related topics that are selected to raise awareness about issues that are also central to many contemporary world's challenges. Our today's speaker is Dr. Michal Kwiecien, who is also a member of St. Louis Polonia board. Michał is a history teacher at Whitfield School in Creve Coeur. He received his doctorate in modern European history at the University of Illinois in Chicago. His talk is about sexual morality in People's Republic of Poland. Apart from the historical and cultural aspects, it's also a story about struggles of everyday people who wanted the same chance as everyone else to pursue health and happiness, earn a living, be safe in their communities, and take care of the ones they love. We hope you'll find this interesting. So please welcome Dr. Michal Kwiecien.
Melissa and Jarek, thank you so much for this wonderful, gracious introduction. I hope everyone can hear me well. And I remain hopeful that there will be no technology or Wi-Fi glitches and that we can have a productive and constructive conversation about sexual morality in the People's Republic of Poland. So thank you so much again for joining us this morning to attend my presentation of this very fascinating history. Before I begin, I would like to highlight the purpose of this talk. As mentioned earlier by Jarek, St. Louis Polonia's mission is centered on raising awareness about social and cultural struggles, which all too often transcend national and state borders. We are an organization devoted to affirming and celebrating cultural diversity, social equity, political pluralism, and inclusion in all the myriad ways that they manifest in our society. The experiences of LGBT people, lesbians, gay men, bisexuals, and transgender individuals, both in Poland and the United States, as well as elsewhere, have not always been integrated within the official narratives of both countries' history. And yet, LGBT people have made consistently important and consequential contributions to cultural life in both contexts. The purpose of my talk then is to shed light on this community and explain the post-war Polish communist state's engagement with sexual identity issues. Because this talk focuses on the state and its representatives, Communist Party officials, scientists, and so-called establishment scholars, much of the discussion will highlight the communist regime's inconsistent ways of articulating its own understanding of human sexuality. My apologies in advance. I periodically include the state's homophobic references to homosexuals as deviants, criminals, and social outcasts. This does not mirror my personal or St. Louis Polonia's understanding of LGBT identities. We are an organization that embraces and accepts LGBT people, and our hope is that this talk will stimulate a conversation about how states, governments, so-called experts, and institutions generate frequently harmful and oppressive interpretations of identity, which polarize societies and produce attitudes and behavior that arouse intolerance and exclusion. The topics included here thus present a snapshot of the Polish communist state's heteronormativity and homophobia. Let us begin with some general historical context. In post-1945 Poland, so post-war Poland, issues of sexuality were very rarely discussed in public. Social movements of the 1960s stimulated a transformation in how Westerners, including Americans, perceived gender and sexuality. East European communist regimes, in contrast, viewed alternatives to a traditional family, such as same-sex relationships, as deviant and threatening to socialist standards of morality. My talk explores the evolution of official perceptions of homosexuality in post-war Poland from the 1960s to the collapse of communism in 1989. I focus on sexual behavior as a form of non-conformity and challenge to the system that sought total control and homogeneity. In post-war Poland, communism, nationalism, and Roman Catholicism converged to create intolerance toward homosexuality. The communist regime interpreted same-sex relations as an unwelcome legacy of the bourgeois capitalist past. Public discussions associated homosexuality with medical and social pathologies like alcoholism, prostitution, and crime. In doing so, the regime harmonized its position on sexual morality with that of the only other independent institution in Poland, the Roman Catholic Church. Church teachings traditionally connected the sexual act exclusively to reproduction within marriage. For both the state and the church, homosexuality was a departure from sexual ethics and the centrality of family in Polish social life. Beginning in the 1960s, the communist regime increasingly saw same-sex relations as a threat to Polish national identity. My investigation makes the communist construction of morality central to the understanding of the role of sexuality in encouraging social conformity. Through exploring communist official views, I will demonstrate how the state utilized sexuality and notions of heteronormativity to outline acceptable systems of social ethics. In Poland, as in many other countries, the assumption that heterosexuality is essential to the functioning of a healthy society shaped discussions on sexual norms in both the communist and the post-communist periods. The emancipationist climate of the 1990s, following 4.5 decades of communist rule, only marginally affected Polish gays and lesbians. Organizing and consciousness raising among gays have had limited successes. Communist repressive measures, in particular Operation Hyacinth, the regime's attempt to control allegedly dangerous gay environments, helped galvanize gay communities. Nevertheless, a cultural space sufficient enough to accommodate a modern gay rights movement is still in development and accelerating, especially in recent years. Social responses to gays and lesbians in Poland vary from ambivalence to pure open hostility to occasional acceptance. Bureaucrats and politicians in post-communist Poland, so after 1989, have generally misunderstood gay and lesbian issues. This misunderstanding of gay concerns, in particular those involving employment, access to healthcare, and civil rights, indicates a major shortcoming in the Polish experiment with democratization. Polish elites rarely conceptualize gays and lesbians as a legitimate social and political constituency. Many gloss over homosexuality as if it did not exist. Gay and lesbian rights are rarely discussed in the context of social justice. Right-wing organizations and Catholic-based groups depict homosexuals as radical abstractions. Fundamentalist Catholic groups like Radio Maria continuously insist that homosexuals stop threatening traditional family values and undermining Polish sovereignty. They perceive gay and lesbian organizations as lobbying groups, as outsiders, intent on subverting heterosexual norms. To many people, the prospect of extending marriage rights to gays and lesbians symbolizes a great moral dilemma. Most alarmingly, however, religious and nationalist organizations portray homosexuality as a threat to the national and religious consciousness of Poles. Now, what are the origins of these attitudes? Some reactions to homosexuals reflect prejudices historically present in other European countries. But these attitudes were also influenced by specific Polish conditions: the traditional link between Roman Catholicism and national identity, and, as I argue here, the secular communist legacy. So my objective in this talk is to demonstrate how cultural attitudes, laws, and institutions shaped the social discourse on sexuality. Polish society was really united in its understanding of homo, bi, or heterosexuality. The scarcity of literature on the emergence of homosexual environments and subcultures in Poland makes it difficult to construct compelling arguments. This talk then is a preliminary attempt to lay the groundwork for a potentially far-reaching investigation. Throughout my talk, I draw on snippets of evidence, in particular the work of Kazimierz Imieliński, a prominent sex expert in communist Poland, to form a basis for a wider discussion on sexuality in Polish social history. In spite of the limitations, the evidence I utilize displays a fragmented picture in which sexuality stands out as a unique theme. For instance, homosexuality figured widely in Imieliński's attempt to demarcate boundaries between what allegedly comprised acceptable as opposed to unacceptable social behavior. He used the language of medical expertise to define the role of normality and deviance in creating healthy sexual lives of Poles. What can Imieliński's work contribute to our own understanding of the cultural discourse on sex and sexuality in communist and post-communist Poland? From the 1960s to the 1980s, but especially during the 60s, Polish communists used the scientific language of sexuality to construct a socialist morality. Both the regime and the scientific establishment which it sponsored associated homo and bisexuality with illness and perversion. Surprisingly, the communist conceptualization of sexual ethics mirrored the attitudes and mores of bourgeois society. George L. Massey, a prominent historian of Germany, analyzed the influence of middle-class respectability and sexuality in constructing societal norms. Massey was one of the first historians of modern Europe to explore the power of nationalism in shaping models of conventional and non-conventional sexualities. In his work, Nationalism and Sexuality, Middle-Class Morality and Sexual Norms in Modern Europe, Massey noticed that communist movements generated a striking contradiction. He argued that during the establishment of the communist regimes in Eastern Europe, I quote, "The overthrow of bourgeois society meant the retention of bourgeois morality. Economic, political, and social revolution was not accompanied by sexual revolution," end quote. Thus, middle-class standards of morality were central to the construction of a working-class social identity. Regardless of communism's pledge to subvert bourgeois culture, communist regimes expected the triumphant proletariat or working class to internalize bourgeois morality. In the course of the 20th century, themes of sexuality fulfilled an intriguing function in the development of a modern Polish state. The process of regulating sexuality in interwar Poland, so the time period between 1918 and 1939, was grounded in religious and familial institutions. Nevertheless, immense transformation that included a national campaign of industrialization and modernization offered a potential for creating homosexual environments. Although public discussions of homosexuality were limited, evidence suggests that artistic and elite milieus provided spaces for homosexual expression. Members of the literary intelligentsia, prominent poets like Jarosław Iwaszkiewicz, cultivated same-sex romances. Non-conventional sex lives of elites were neither necessarily secretive nor widely condemned. In 1932, only 14 years after independence, Poland became one of the first European countries to decriminalize homosexuality. Nevertheless, as progressive as this may appear, just to put it in perspective, Western European states like Great Britain or West Germany did not take such measures until the 1960s and 70s. Polish society tended to perceive homosexuality still as a sexual deviation and disease, no matter what the law had said. The post-war communist regime in Poland did not fully adopt the official views of sexuality from the Soviet Union. Although Polish communists considered homosexuality pathological, they left the 1932 law decriminalizing same-sex relations unscathed, so they didn't change that law. Unlike Poland, in the Soviet Union, homosexuality enjoyed legal sanction only 1 decade. The Bolsheviks, or the Russian revolutionaries, the communists, in 1922, they passed social legislation which permitted same-sex sexual intercourse between consenting adults. By 1934, however, Stalin recriminalized homosexual acts. He interpreted homosexuality as an affront, as a major offense to proletarian morality, and so-called pederasts as class enemies. Despite its continued legal status, Polish communists initially ignored same-sex relations, instead promoting heterosexual marriage and reproduction. Perceptions of sex in the state-sponsored advice literature were largely connected to a very rigid and binary notion of gender performance. The communist regime emphasized gender difference to enhance its promotion of family and marriage. Within this understanding, male erotic domination of allegedly passive and restrained females fulfilled the criteria of a healthy Polish sexuality. The popular cultural press, like Ty I Ja, or You and I in translation, as well as prominent scientific publications, regarded non-heterosexual sex acts as incompatible with mainstream social norms. In the eyes of the state, the sexual deviant and homosexual created a significant danger to social conformity. One of the most prominent authorities on sexual matters and the pioneer of Polish sexology, Kazimierz Imielinski, contributed to shaping models of sexual morality in communist Poland. In his medical research and popular articles about sexuality, Imielinski introduced the topic of homosexual relations into the public discourse. He frequently contributed an advice column on sexual matters in popular publications such as You and I. When he engaged the public through popular articles, he regularly affirmed the centrality of heterosexuality to healthy sexual lifestyles. In the early 1960s, Imieliński combined medical, social, and moral approaches to explain non-conventional sexuality. He often argued that homosexuality was abnormal and dangerous. Although he was more receptive to the environmental origins hypothesis, interestingly, Imieliński never discounted biology as a factor in shaping homosexuality. Regardless of origins, he downplayed homosexuality as an acceptable lifestyle option. Imieliński did not hide that he considered both homosexuality and bisexuality as threats to social conformity. How did a groundbreaking expert like Imieliński unmask the dark mysteries of homo and bisexuality? What kind of scientific models was he using? Given Poland's position in the communist camp in the Soviet bloc, did he borrow his ideas from Soviet scientists to the East? In a section on modern interpretations of homosexuality, Imieliński listed the important contributions of Western sexology and Western experts in explaining sexual orientation, which was very different from what was happening in the Soviet Union at the same time. Intriguingly, Imieliński was interested in scientific claims of prominent sexologists who in many cases refused to condemn homosexuality. His work proliferates with references to Richard Krafft-Ebing, Magnus Hirschfeld, and Alfred Kinsey. The appearance of Hirschfeld is perhaps most unusual. A gay man himself, Hirschfeld was a known advocate of gay and lesbian rights in the Weimar Republic in interwar Germany, right before Hitler took power. Imieliński concurred with Hirschfeld's statistics pertaining to the negligent number of homosexuals in society. He claimed that about 3.4% of society was or identified as homosexual. An even rudimentary allusion to Soviet sexology, however, was nowhere to be found. There were virtually no connections between Polish sexology and Soviet sexology, which is interesting. Polish approaches to homosexuality, especially after 1956, appeared to be independent from Soviet official views. Indeed, this indicated that the Polish scientific community was much more open to the West than in the Soviet Union. Imieliński explained that across history, societies either glorified, tolerated, or condemned behaviors like homosexuality, which he almost always considered a behavior. To his readers, he advised treating sexual deviance with compassion and respect. Ultimately, he claimed they should be dealt with sympathy, like sick people who don't have control over their illness. Now, 2 decades later, sociologist Jerzy Kwaśniewski's Society and Deviance in Communist Poland, originally published in 1984, expanded the idea of homosexuality as a social construct. Kwaśniewski was one of the most influential sociologists of the 1980s. Unlike Imieliński, Kwaśniewski did not link deviance to immorality or perversion. While Imieliński exclusively looked at sexual behavior, Kwaśniewski also focused on other social issues such as alcoholism, drug addiction, bribery, theft, and murder. He interpreted deviance as a prism through which society understood reality. According to Kwaśniewski, society played a very important role in delineating what ultimately constituted deviance. Consequently, society negotiated with cultural, religious, and political institutions to determine what was acceptable and what was unacceptable social behavior. Kwaśniewski's opinion surveys, and he had so many, indicated that the perception of homosexuals as social and cultural threats was very strong. Kwaśniewski's study demonstrated that not all Poles internalized the conflation of homosexuality with deviation and nonconformity. Unlike Kwaśniewski, Imieliński was not interested in scrutinizing social attitudes. Instead, he used science to explain sexual behavior to the public. Imieliński constructed a model of normality that did not always reflect the behaviors and attitudes of society. By using science, he created norms that were not supposed to be open to contestation. He reinforced the dominant state-propagated models of proper sexuality with supposedly scientific and thus irrefutable arguments. So you can't argue with science. In contrast to Imieliński, Kwaśniewski expanded the meaning of deviance. He recognized society's influence in shaping the discourse of normality. He did acknowledge that society had some power here. Social perceptions of sensitive and often controversial subjects complicated the picture of conformity the communist regime attempted to advance. Although Kwaśniewski did not openly advocate the social integration of homosexuals, his work demonstrated that society remained far from united in its attitudes to gays and lesbians. And it's encouraging for us to see that even as early as the 1980s, there were Poles who openly embraced or were at least open to acknowledging that this kind of community existed and that this community should be accepted. Now, during the last decade of communist rule, government officials inferred that homosexuals posed a serious threat to the general health of society. In the mid-1980s, the communist state responded to the growing threat of the AIDS pandemic by instituting what they called Operation Hyacinth in English translation. In Polish, it's Akcja Hyacinth, like the flower hyacinth. While officially presented as a venture to protect public health, Hyacinth entailed the interrogation and detainment, the incarceration of hundreds of Polish, mostly male homosexuals. Czesław Kiszczak, the powerful interior minister, spearheaded this operation. According to Jerzy Kiżyński, a researcher of Akcja Hyacinth, there was a flawed misperception that by controlling Poland's homosexual population, by collecting data on their activities, through the establishment of special homosexual files, the confinement of that deadly disease he was referring to, AIDS, could be easily secured. Thus, homosexuality supposedly undermined the conformity the communist regime worked so hard to preserve. Most importantly, homosexuals challenged socialist morality and the regime's monopoly of social, political, and cultural power. A careful screening campaign of gay and lesbian suspects comprised a central feature of the Operation Hyacinth or Akcja Hyacinth. To meet the epidemiological challenge of AIDS, the party interior ministry established 11,000 so-called pink files, in Polish różowe kartoteki. The files included critical data on Poland's most vulnerable homosexuals. The government justified Hyacinth by stressing the criminal character of gay environments. Aside from linking homosexuals to HIV transmission, Communist Party members failed to define the precise crimes gays and lesbians allegedly engaged in. Interestingly, the government did nothing to overturn the 1932 law decriminalizing homosexuality. So while these attitudes are changing and LGBT people, in particular homosexual men, are being haunted by the communist state, this law from 1932 continues to be on the books, decriminalizing homosexuality, which is fascinating in itself, why the communists did not implement a law criminalizing homosexual behavior, since they were so fascinated by it and controlling it. So if anything, this entire operation, Akcja Hyacinth, demonstrated that in its last throes of existence, the communist regime cared little about creating a pretense of legality, as long as it was convinced of the mortal danger that homosexuality supposedly posed. The communists saw no use in concealing their repressive agenda. Now, regardless of its intentions to limit the threat of HIV, the regime's Hyacinth experiment proved a miserable failure. Throughout the 1980s, HIV transmission cases in Poland continued to increase unabatedly. The impact of Operation Hyacinth, however, had some significant long-term social implications. Hyacinth was a catalyst for the launching of an organized gay and lesbian rights movement, especially after 1989. The regime's endeavor to control homosexual environments in the end fostered the formation of homosexual resistance. The more gays were hunted and persecuted, the more a consciousness developed and a sense of community was born. Thus, the communist obsession with enforcing gender and sexual conformity, its enlistment of scientific authorities like Imieliński, ultimately backfired. Interior Minister Kiszczak's plan to persecute gays and lesbians strengthened the so-called underground consciousness of Polish homosexuals. Gay men and women started to organize on a small, though previously unprecedented scale. At the same time, Kwiecien was central in exposing the bankruptcy of the communist system and the need for reform. Ultimately, the development of a gay and lesbian consciousness in Poland coincided with the demise of communism and the onset of a new democratic politics. Moreover, in spite of its great significance, Kwiecien did not spark a nationwide homosexual rebellion on par with the Gay Liberation Front movement in 1960s America. Lesbians and gay men continued to not exist in the public consciousness. Gay activism in the late 1980s and throughout the 1990s was very limited and outside the public sphere. University students supplied the primary force of lesbian and gay organizing. Scholars tend to credit Waldemar Sporalski and Sławomir Starosta, both students of sociology, as the main architects of the post-Kwiecien homosexual underground. In 1987, for instance, Zboralski coordinated the activities of 3 different gay youth groups in Warsaw, Gdańsk, and Wrocław. Prior to the collapse of the communist regime, both Zboralski and Starosta witnessed the tenuous beginnings of a gay print press. The first semi-official gay press in Poland appeared in 1987, Filo in Gdańsk and Ephebos in Warsaw. In 1989, the Warsaw homosexual movement initiated the gay and lesbian group Lambda. That same year, the Wrocław and Gdańsk groups Etap and Filo helped organize the nationwide Association of Lambda Groups. In addition, now despite the goals of social reform and economic liberalization, Poland after 1989 focused primarily on privatization and free market innovations, not homosexual rights. The post-communist state continued to disregard gay and lesbian citizens, as if they didn't exist. Although the newly arisen political parties did not cater to homosexuals, none of them toyed with anti-gay witch hunts on the scale of Operation Kwiecien. Curiously, in spite of the mounting homophobia, the government continued not to change the 1932 law sanctioning homosexuality. Polish society, however, considered homosexuals an, I quote, illegitimate, underprivileged, retreatist minority having no outside power, end quote. For many Poles, homosexuals lack the necessary external credentials to represent an authentic minority group. Links to outside states or cultural groups were supposedly essential to validate a particular group's status as a minority. For example, the small community of Silesian Germans is a valid minority because of its ties to a greater outside nation, Germany. Interestingly, the uncertain status of homosexuals within Polish society made it easier for leaders and politicians to overlook, if not endorse, homophobia. At the same time, a cultural minority embodying the role of the so-called other serves to reaffirm Polish national identity. At the turn of the 21st century, Poland is a homogeneous nation state, at least culturally. It is majority Polish and Roman Catholic. This is largely, of course, a result of World War II and post-war population transfers and border shifts. The modern nationalist conception of Polishness necessitates, however, a real or imagined threat from a cultural group that is understood as being outsiders, as being different. Now, traditionally in Polish history, Jews, Germans, and Ukrainians, as well as other groups, fulfilled the role of the so-called other. In the context of the homogeneous nation state where most people are ethnically Polish and Catholic, however, the invention of threatening minorities is central to mobilizing society. In the absence of traditional ethnic minorities, the revolutionary and non-conformist homosexual is the next best thing. Gays and lesbians fill the void vacated by Jews, Germans, and Ukrainians. They personify the alleged cunningness and wickedness of the long gone yet still resented image of the Jew. Agnieszka Graf, who's a Polish feminist writer, had this fascinating quote, and I translate it here in English, which tries to draw a link between how traditionally Polish society perceived Jews and how now elements within Polish society perceive homosexuals. I quote, "It's not a myth, it's very true. You see a gay, you see a Jew." And so once again, there's this assumption that every time the government wants to mobilize Poles, very often it invokes the image of the other. Traditionally, that image has been personified by the Jews or Germans, Ukrainians. Nowadays, in a more homogeneous context where most people are Polish and Catholic, this other is the homosexual. So traditional segments of Polish society remain deeply susceptible to divisive nationalist messages espousing a Catholic morality and so-called heterosexual norms. We also see this very recently, for instance, in the presidential race in 2020, when the president of Poland invoked, so-called LGBT ideology and some kind of homosexual agenda to rally his electorate, mobilized the Polish population behind his own political agenda, and it seems to have worked, at least recently. For many people, ultimately, these messages make the acceptance of homosexuals very difficult, of course. Now, to a large extent, social attitudes to homosexuality in contemporary Poland are an arduous legacy of the communist period in Polish history. Perhaps surprisingly, the communist era strengthened prejudices against homosexuals, even though the law did not condemn them. Catholicism, communism, and nationalism converged to shape an unreceptive social environment to issues of homo and bisexuality. And it seems that the nationalist component, both before and after 1989, worked against tolerating and accepting sexual minorities, and also against gender equality, as we are now seeing in Poland with the women's strike movement, which is a topic for another time. Moreover, in the post-communist period, the emergent lesbian and gay movement encountered a society in which nationalism, Catholicism, and heteronormativity were powerful social forces, rarely sympathetic to radical societal transformation. In consequence, LGBT activists wrestled with different cultural strategies aimed at stimulating social change in Poland. Fear, concealment, uncertainty, and lack of resources characterized the primary phase of lesbian and gay activism. Nevertheless, Poland's candidacy to enter the European Union, as well as the expansion of gay civil unions and marriage rights in Western Europe and elsewhere, like in the United States, contributed toward galvanizing new activist strategies centering on campaigns of visibility. In turn of the 21st century Poland, LGBT activists forged important coalitions with heterosexual allies to educate society about the mainstream nature of lesbian and gay life. Equality marches, parades, and artistic exhibitions exposed real lesbians and gays, not caricatures, while simultaneously propelling homosexuals into the public sphere. So there is a silver lining. It's not all doom and gloom. There is actually a larger openness now among segments of Polish society to embracing LGBT people. Time and time again, activists promote a vision of lesbians and gay men as members of families, and most importantly, legitimate members of the nation. Poland has also been fortunate in seeing an increasingly visible and active political leadership that includes openly LGBT officials and cultural commentators, such as Robert Biedroń, Anna Grodzka, Krzysztof Śmiszek, and Father Szymon Niemiec. there's also a host of other individuals who are visible and active. These intrepid individuals are an ongoing reminder that LGBT people are an indispensable social force and important players in Polish social and political life. Appropriating a cultural territory for lesbians and gays within Polish society entails for many activists inclusion within the dominant social and cultural structures. A society committed to pluralism, as well as the expansion of the public sphere to include sexual minorities, is indispensable to the realization of gay civil and human rights. Thank you again for listening, and I look forward to hearing some of your questions and addressing them.
Thank you so much, Michal. We actually do not have any questions at this time, which is a little surprising. So while you guys are putting any potential questions you might have in the chat box, I'll remind you to fill out that virtual sign-in sheet. I put a link there in the chat box. And also I put a link to St. Louis County Library's YouTube page, which is where you'll be able to see a recording of this program. So go ahead and bookmark that now, and then I'll have that up there within, I would say, probably by Monday. Yeah, Michal, your presentation must have been so thorough that no one's left with any questions, which happens sometimes.
That's wonderful. Okay, I see
we have one. Okay, so one of our patrons asked, are LGBT individuals discriminated against in the workforce?
In the Polish workforce today. So the thing that makes the situation very very complicated in Poland is, I mean, there's so many interesting contradictions that, and as I mentioned, this talk is a preliminary attempt to address the issue of LGBT history in modern Poland. So there's obviously more opportunities to elaborate, but this is interesting. So initially, once Poland entered the European Union, and even as a condition of membership in the EU, essentially Poland was supposed to liberalize its laws and include protections for all kinds of groups, including groups that were traditionally not recognized as part of Polish society, provide them with all kinds of protections in the labor force. And so while those protections do exist, because they have been mandated by the EU, they're not always equally enforced. And so the problem is one with enforcement. The other issue is that while LGBT people do enjoy certain protections in Polish social and economic life, for instance, there's no legislation banning hate crimes. So there are these, contradictions, inconsistencies that make it seem like, on the one hand, there is openness, but that openness also awkwardly coexists with restrictions and inconsistencies and attempts on the part of the Polish government, especially since the year 2015. There's a populist right-wing government that has essentially chipped away at the political autonomy and the civil liberties that would protect women's rights and also LGBT rights. And this has created all kinds of tensions, and we're seeing this literally unfold as we speak here in Poland right now. There's strikes and protests, of course, mostly over the recently passed, abortion law, but there's also, you see a lot of participation on the part of LGBT individuals, because they also see the government as essentially threatening to revoke a lot of the privileges and rights and protections that they have been able to acquire because of Poland's membership in the EU. So it's a complicated response to a very good question.
Now, with there not being any legislation against hate crimes, another patron asks, are there any recommendations that you would have for travelers to Poland who are LGBTQ+? And is there anything that American supporters of the LGBTQ+ community can do to encourage more openness in Poland?
I'm loving these questions. At the same time, I just want to emphasize that I don't necessarily speak for either LGBT people in Poland or for the government, or it's just, it's once again a complicated response to an excellent question. So look, Poland, just to grasp the politics of it, there is a significant, I would even argue that, the country's so thoroughly polarized that there are so many post-war accepting of LGBT people. There are so many safe spaces in Poland. And I do want to emphasize this. I have recently taken a group of Whitfield students to Poland on an international trip for about a week. This was prior to the pandemic in 2019. And I had parents ask the same question, is my child going to be safe because my child identifies as LGBT? And I said, yes, of course. First of all, we're going to be together constantly. You're going to be safe. Poland is not, in the Middle Ages, although sometimes when you trace Polish politics, it seems like, they're stuck in a different era. Urban centers in particular, when Americans travel, when Westerners travel to Warsaw, Kraków, Wrocław, Gdańsk, I mean, there's so many of these spaces that seem to be very liberal, progressive, open, with actual communities, and infrastructure and institutions that exist in those places. There are places of safety, just like in America. There are places where if you identify as lesbian, gay, or transgender, you may feel safer in this, living in the St. Louis metro area or in Chicago, New York. You may feel less safe in other parts of the country. So the same is true of Poland. There are cultural spaces that have been carved out where LGBT people can actually be open and openly identify and be so-called out, right? Be out to the broader public. And then there's places where it probably would not be safe to be out. And so, to the point about travelers from the U.S. or elsewhere, in the urban centers, in a lot of these larger communities, and increasingly even in smaller communities, it is safe. It is safe to be out. And the government itself, it's been chipping away at so many of the democratic institutions in Poland. It's pretty clear that there is a bulk of the population that does not support what the government is doing. And a lot of this is coming down from the top. And I would hesitate to make people think that a lot of these homophobic attitudes are coming from the bottom. I mean, it's really complicated, right? And Polish society, just like American society, is deeply polarized, deeply split about many of these issues. So I'm going to leave it there, but I appreciate the question. Yeah.
Thank you. That kind of leads into the next question. One of our patron writes, I am a gay Jew whose maternal family came to Chicago from Krakow. It seems that the political upheaval provides an opportunity for the bizarre radical ideas to gain a foothold. Do you see a similarity between what we are going through here in the United States and the situation in Poland?
Thank you, and a shout out. I am a gay man from Kraków, so just saying. So happy to meet people with connections to Kraków. Simple answer, yes. Definitely. I wouldn't want to elaborate too much, but as we all know, we live in these, we no longer live in silos. There's no longer an iron curtain. So yes, definitely the things that are happening here have an impact on what's happening there, and vice versa, right? The winds of history are blowing in both directions. I definitely see tons, surprisingly many connections between what is happening in the West, including the United States, and what's happening in Poland. But of course, there are also those very specific Polish conditions. One of them being the Roman Catholic Church, for instance, is this major institution that has been empowered since the collapse of communism. And it's been able to, although I don't want to downplay and say that religious institutions in America don't have the same kind of influence, but because Poland is a bit more religiously homogenous, that institution there has a lot more influence than any church or religious institution that I've noticed in the United States. So yes and no, but definitely more yes.
Thank you. Another patron wonders, is there police violence against the gay community, especially the trans community, as there is here?
Yes. Goodness, a lot of these, and once again, I don't want to trivialize the question by just giving a one-word response, but yeah, we've seen, especially recently, violence, police brutality, even against women and the supporters of the women's strikes in Poland. It's definitely been highlighted by especially the non-state government media. The government in Poland has incrementally and recently increasingly rapidly taken over the media. So sometimes those images of police brutality against trans people or LGBT people in general, or women, or any of the people who are striking or protesting right now in Poland, sometimes they're kind of muted. But in definitely the private media, you see a lot more depictions, and in particular, Western media has been also highlighting instances of police brutality. So I think the short answer here is definitely yes, we've seen that.
We are getting some really excellent questions. So let's see here. A patron asks, do you see the possibility of a top level turnaround in Poland like the one that we have just had here?
So I always gravitate towards optimism, but there's also that not pessimistic side of me, but the realistic side. So I'm going to, without necessarily invoking too many examples from the United States, but, our country, the guardrails of our democratic system have been definitely tested. And, the audience can be the judge of how well our democratic institutions withheld or held out or resisted the recent challenges and obstacles, threats, right? Poland is more complicated, and I don't necessarily probably have the time, neither would I want to monopolize this time to tell you all about what's happening right now with the Law and Justice Party and the government. But essentially, the government has been taking over all of these other independent institutions like the judiciary. And if you ask me personally, I think a country that claims to be a democracy but does not have an independent judiciary, where the three branches of government are essentially monopolized, taken over by one political party that definitely has a program and an agenda that's not friendly towards women or LGBT individuals, that's a problem. And so while I do feel encouraged by the protests, by the people who are right now fighting to save pluralism, democracy, civil society in Poland, and I'm encouraged by what I see, just thousands of people out in the streets, and really not even in big cities like Warsaw or Kraków or Wrocław, but even in smaller communities, increasingly, these protests are reaching, smaller and smaller communities, because the Law and Justice Party, this far-right populist party in Poland, has been more, I would say, effective at crippling Poland's democratic institutions, even more effective than, our recent president in the United States. I fear sometimes that, that the future may be a lot more gray and a lot more complicated to diagnose or forecast. But at the same time, if you see how people are feeling, and if you see that, the sort of popular sentiment, and the world is watching what's unfolding in Poland, Belarus, Hungary, and elsewhere, Russia, for instance, right, just very recently, I'm encouraged that the government may at some point bend, or that there may be kind of, openings for a successful opposition to emerge. And there is an opposition in Poland that's just been fractured in different places, but it is coming together. So my understanding is there's room for optimism, but it has to be this cautious optimism, because we also have to keep in mind that the government is acting in ways that we have not seen in Poland since the communist regime was in power. It's increasingly more assertive, and increasingly it has taken over a lot of these, institutions and branches of government that, well, in any healthy democracy, should be independent. So it's a complicated response to, once again, an awesome question.
Thank you. Okay, we have one last question, and it's a great one to end with. One of our patrons asks, if they send this program on YouTube to their family in Poland and Krakow, would they be surprised?
By what they heard at this talk? You know what? I hope not. I hope not. And you know what? I strongly identify with Kraków. It is my hometown. And the people I know in Kraków, friends and family members, are so open-minded and progressive. I think that you know, they just feel deeply, deeply disturbed and ashamed of what's happening with the political situation. I don't think if the individual asking the question shares this, this recording with their family, that they would be necessarily surprised. But, you know, just like in any community, in any place, you're going to find a diversity of opinion and people with very, you know, with varying levels of consciousness about all kinds of issues, right? So I say please share, and hopefully if it is new content for them, then hopefully we've opened up a few minds. But my guess is that you know, the majority of Poles, particularly in these, you know, larger urban areas like Warsaw, Kraków, Wrocław, Gdańsk, you know, probably wouldn't be surprised by what they hear here. So thank you again.
Well, thank you both, Jarek and Michal. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your expertise with our patrons. Jarek, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, that's okay. I wanted to thank Michał and thank you for hosting this event. And as a follow-up to the last question, I would like to encourage Teresa to share it. Absolutely, share it with everyone. Please share this program with as many people as you can. It is our goal also to show that St. Louis Polonia is an open-minded organization, and we would like to reach out to as many segments of society as that's possible. We welcome conversation. That's really what it's about, and conversation that is civil and that is also where the questions are being asked and answered. So thank you again, Melissa, for hosting us here. Thank you.
Yes, thank you everyone for joining in on this rainy Saturday morning. This YouTube recording will be available probably by Monday. So go ahead and bookmark that St. Louis County Library YouTube page so you know where to look for it. And also, if you don't mind filling out the virtual sign-in sheet, there is a place on there to leave your email address, which will be shared with our friends at the St. Louis Polonia Society. So you can stay tuned with other events and discussions and talks or presentations that they will have coming up. At this time, this is the end of the program, so we will turn our cameras off. However, I will leave the program going for 10 more minutes in case you need to collect any of the links in the chat box. You'll have plenty of opportunity to do so. So thank you, everyone, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.